The first time I saw the fog rise from the Black Sea, it didn't roll in like weather. It climbed like something alive. From the top of the rig, it looked almost beautiful, curling around the cranes and swallowing the floodlights. But by dawn, the radios were full of whispers that didn't belong to any of us. That was when I learned there are 11 rules every worker here must follow if we want to see the next sunrise. Most of them make no sense until you break one. I did once, by accident, and ever since that morning, I've heard my own voice calling me from the fog. The first time I heard that rule, I laughed. A man who'd spent half his life staring at gray horizons shouldn't be afraid of a little fog, right? But out here, miles from land, logic doesn't always help. The foreman read Rule 1. Never look directly into the fog until the siren stops, like he was reciting scripture. His voice steady but low, the wind trying to steal the words from us. I didn't understand why he looked past us, instead of at us when he said it. That night, I learned how the fog forms faster than weather should. 1 minute the sea breathes steady and calm, and the next it exhales something thick enough to erase the deck lights. I was in the operator's cabin, watching gauges tremble. When the warning siren began, the sound crawled through the metal, dull and heavy, vibrating the soles of my boots. Outside the window, the ocean vanished behind a wall of pale gray that seemed to move like a slow heartbeat. The others went still whenever that siren began. No one spoke, no one looked toward the glass. It felt like theater, as if we were pretending not to notice the world disappearing. I tried to follow their example, keeping my eyes on the control levers, but curiosity itched behind my skull. The fog pressed against the window like a living thing, almost brushing the glass. I told myself it was only moisture, only air and water mixing wrong. Still, I felt watched. Minutes stretched, the siren refusing to die. Somewhere below, footsteps passed, slow, deliberate, and then a voice I knew shouldn't be awake whispered my name. It sounded exactly like Marco, our deckhand, but softer, as if spoken through a pillow. I turned instinctively toward the window, but Petrov, my shift partner, gripped my shoulder so hard it hurt. "Don't," he said. "Not until it ends." His eyes were fixed on the floor, wide and glistening. We waited together in that metal box while the siren droned on, the air heavy with salt and fear. I tried counting breaths, then seconds, then anything to keep from glancing outside. Every few moments, the fog pulsed. That's the only way I can describe it, dimming the light before swelling brighter again. It reminded me of lungs filling and emptying. When the siren finally stopped, the silence hit like a wave, and the fog began to retreat, slipping away across the deck as if tugged by invisible hands. Petrov exhaled hard, finally letting go of me. "You nearly broke it," he muttered. "You don't look until it stops, or it remembers you." His choice of words made no sense, but his tone left no room for argument. We stepped out into the damp air. The rig's metal bones dripped condensation that looked almost oily. Everything smelled faintly wrong, like rust mixed with something sweet. Far across the water, the fog gathered itself again, waiting. Later in the mess hall, the others avoided my eyes. Marco sat at the far table, head down, hands clasped tight. When I asked if he'd called my name earlier, he didn't answer. He just stared at the floor and muttered, "I never talk when the siren's on." I wanted to press him, but the foreman entered, carrying a thermos and that same uneasy calm. He said the system showed a sudden pressure drop near the southern line, the one closest to the trench. We'd check it in the morning. "For now," he said, "stay inside if the fog comes early." Sleep didn't come easy. My cabin walls groaned with every shift of the sea. I kept replaying that whisper, my name floating through the fog, trying to convince myself it had been the wind. At some point, the generator flickered, dimming the light. In the half-dark, I could have sworn I saw shapes move outside the porthole, silhouettes gliding through mist that wasn't supposed to be there. I squeezed my eyes shut until morning. Dawn arrived colorless, the sun pale as bone. The deck was slick and cold, and in one corner near the crane base, I found footprints, bare, small, and leading straight toward the railing. The metal under them wasn't wet, it was dry, almost scorched. When I called Petrov over, he only said, "Don't follow where they end. Not on the first day." His voice trembled. The footprints stopped exactly at the edge, as if whoever made them had stepped straight into the fog and never come back. The rest of the day passed in uneasy routine. The radios crackled with static, sometimes forming half words we pretended not to hear. At noon, we hoisted a new container, its surface slick with condensation, despite clear skies. The fog hadn't returned yet, but everyone kept glancing at the horizon, waiting for it. I felt the rule gnawing at me, untested but already too real. By sunset, the line between sea and sky blurred, and a familiar low hum drifted through the rig, the first warning that the siren would soon sound again. When it did, I froze. The fog came faster this time, sweeping over the platform in less than a minute. The air turned white, then silver, then gray so deep I could taste it. Somewhere inside that thickness, something moved, a dark shape sliding across the cranes. My hand reached for the window lever. Before I realized what I was doing, I stopped myself just in time, forcing my eyes shut. The siren moaned on, endless, the metal under my feet trembling like a heartbeat. Then through the noise, I heard my name again, but this time it was my own voice calling. When morning came, the fog was gone, but the silence felt heavier than the sea itself. Everyone moved slower, eyes red from lack of sleep, each man pretending nothing strange had happened. The foreman gathered us near the crane pit, reading Rule 2. Always count the crew before the fog clears from his old notebook, as if it were routine maintenance. His voice cracked once, but no one mentioned it. I looked around, counting without being told, and realized I'd lost track halfway through because some faces didn't look quite right in the pale light. Petrov nudged me, whispering that we should get breakfast before the generators started another cycle. The mess hall smelled of coffee and diesel, the kind of mix that usually meant comfort out here. Yet everyone kept glancing at the door. We were supposed to be 12 men that week. I counted 13 sitting at the tables. No one else seemed to notice, or maybe they all did and refused to acknowledge it. The extra figure sat at the end, face hidden behind a cap, spoon moving mechanically. Every time I blinked, I thought he shifted a little closer to me. I tried to convince myself I was tired. That last night's fog had played tricks on my mind. Still, when the foreman finished his head count later on deck, he frowned and ran the numbers again. "We're clear," he said finally. Though his voice lacked conviction, the fog was already stirring again, beyond the horizon, a thin smear against the gray sky. I wanted to ask what happens if we miscount, but his eyes told me not to. By afternoon, the hum of machinery filled the air. I took my post inside the crane cabin, high above the deck. From up there, the sea looked endless, a dark sheet of glass. The fog began forming earlier than expected, creeping toward us in thin strands that moved like smoke underwater. I could see the others below, tiny shapes loading equipment, but one by one they stopped, looking out to sea. The siren hadn't sounded yet, and that scared me more than its noise ever could. Without warning, the intercom crackled alive. All personnel begin head count procedure. Petrov's voice came through first, listing names in his usual lazy rhythm. Then others followed from different stations, each confirming numbers. I waited for mine, repeating names in my head. When I finished, I realized one was missing. Marco. He should have been at the southern walkway. I called his name over the radio, static answering in a rhythm that almost sounded like breathing. Petrov told me not to worry, said Marco had probably gone to fix a valve, but something about the pause before he spoke felt wrong. The fog reached the rig within minutes. It rose like a tide, swallowing everything from below. The decks vanished. The sea disappeared. Even the crane's arms seemed to fade into gray. My radio hissed with overlapping voices, none clear enough to understand. I kept counting. 12, 13, 12 again, my mind circling numbers that wouldn't settle. Then the cabin door handle twitched, just once, soft enough that I thought I'd imagined it. When I looked back through the glass, a faint silhouette moved along the outer walkway, slow and deliberate. The shape looked like Marco, same height, same gait, but something about the way it turned its head, too smooth, too slow, froze me in place. I wanted to call out, to tell him to get inside, yet my throat refused to open. The fog pressed harder against the glass, and for a moment, the figure's outline seemed to stretch upward, taller than the rails around it. Then the siren blared at last, cutting through everything. I shut my eyes, remembering Petrov's warning from before, don't look until it stops. Minutes passed. The siren ended when I dared open my eyes. The fog had thinned just enough to see the deck again. The walkway where the figure had stood was empty. My radio crackled once more, Petrov shouting something about a missing crewman. I climbed down, boots echoing against wet metal, and joined the others near the crane base. The foreman's face was pale, lips pressed tight. Count again, he ordered. We formed a line, calling names like a ritual. 12 voices answered. 13 shadows fell on the deck. Nobody spoke for a while. The extra shadow stayed where it was, stretched longer than any of ours, though no one stood there. The foreman finally broke the silence, saying the sun would burn it off soon. He told us to get back to work. We obeyed because pretending was easier than asking questions we weren't ready to hear answered. By dusk, the fog had retreated far out to sea, but the feeling of being one man too many clung to us, like the salt air. That night, the foreman visited each cabin, checking bunks quietly. He didn't say what he was looking for. When he reached mine, he paused at the doorway, staring at the porthole. Outside, the sea glowed faintly, a strange green shimmer rising beneath the surface. If you ever lose count, he murmured, don't try to fix it. Let the fog take what it came for. Then he left, closing the door softly behind him. I barely slept. Around midnight, footsteps passed my cabin again, measured, patient, stopping outside each door. When they reached mine, they lingered. I held my breath. A faint tapping followed, almost polite, then silence. By morning, Marco's bunk was empty. His boots sat neatly under the frame, laces tied. The others said he'd probably gone early to check the southern pumps, but no one offered to go look for him. The fog was already forming again, climbing the horizon like smoke rising from something deep below. We gathered for the next count as the siren began its low cry. This time I made sure to start before the fog reached us, repeating every name like a prayer. 12, I said it again. 12. The air turned thick, voices fading one by one until only mine remained. Then through the static of the radio, another voice joined, mine echoing back the same list in perfect timing. I froze, realizing it wasn't coming from my speaker, but from somewhere out on the deck. When the siren stopped, the fog cleared enough to show footprints leading away from the crane base, bare, wet, heading toward the sea. By the time the sun fell behind the horizon, the fog had returned in thick, rolling sheets, heavier than anything I'd seen before. I remembered Rule 3, never speak to a shadow that isn't yours, as I climbed the ladder to the crane cabin, my hands shaking slightly despite the chill in the air. Every step felt louder than it should have, echoing against the steel like someone or something was matching me. I told myself it was just nerves, that after yesterday, any shadow could seem alive, but the deck below seemed wrong, distorted, with shapes moving at angles that made no sense. I was alone in the operator's cabin, and the rig felt abandoned, yet full of presence. I watched the fog curl around the base of the cranes like smoke from some invisible fire. Shapes emerged at the edge of visibility, tall and thin, unmoving, yet impossibly close. I couldn't bring myself to speak, remembering the rule. Even muttering a question felt dangerous. One shadow, elongated and indistinct, mirrored my stance on the catwalk. I wanted to call it by name, to see if it would respond, but my lips pressed together against instinct. The intercom crackled faintly, voices overlapping in hurried tones, though none matched anyone I recognized. It made my skin crawl because I couldn't tell if the calls were real or just reflections of the fog's own voice. Somewhere below, a clatter, metal striking metal, echoed sharply. My stomach twisted. I forced myself to focus on the crane controls, to pretend the world beyond the glass didn't exist. But every instinct screamed that the shadows were aware of me, moving in silent synchronization, waiting for the moment I'd break the rule. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The fog thickened, pressing against the cabin walls, carrying with it the scent of salt and something faintly metallic. My thoughts returned to the extra figure from yesterday, the one that had appeared and disappeared in the count. Could it be the same here? I refused to look directly at the shapes for longer than a second. Each time I glanced, they seemed to twitch, as if responding to my fear. I imagined hearing my name whispered, even though no sound could have penetrated that wall of mist. Petrov's voice eventually came over the radio, soft and strained. "Don't let them hear you," he said, almost as if he were warning himself more than me. I nodded, though he couldn't see. I stayed in the cabin, eyes darting only when necessary to operate the crane, watching the shadows lengthen with the dim light. The fog's density made it hard to tell what was real. Shapes that shouldn't have been there hovered along the walkways, sometimes mimicking familiar movements, and I reminded myself again that speaking would be worse than futile. It could be fatal. Then the shadow at the catwalk moved closer, sliding silently along the steel railing toward me. I froze, hands gripping the crane's joystick so tightly it ached. My mind raced, recalling Rule 3. Never speak to a shadow that isn't yours. If I made a sound, if I even breathed too loudly, it might recognize me. And then what? I couldn't think about that. I could only wait, counting my breaths, feeling the fog push closer with every exhale. It felt alive, pressing into the cabin, forcing me to confront the shapes without flinching. Time lost meaning. The fog swirled and pulsed, the shadows bending in ways that defied logic. My own shadow stretched unnaturally along the cabin floor, and for a moment, I wondered if I had been speaking aloud without realizing it. I didn't dare look again. Every instinct I had screamed to keep silent, to avoid the shadow's gaze entirely. I pictured the faces of the crew from earlier, the ones who had disappeared, and the thought that perhaps they had broken this rule haunted me. How easy it would be to call out to someone and never hear them again. A sudden shift in the fog caught my eye, though I didn't move toward it. One of the shadows seemed to separate from the rest, approaching the cabin slowly, gliding, almost buoyant. My heart thudded, each beat louder than the last, threatening to betray me. I imagined saying something, even a whisper, and the consequences made my stomach churn. My hands ached from gripping the crane, but I didn't dare release them. Silence was the only protection, my only way to survive until the fog receded. Hours passed, the siren didn't sound this time, leaving me alone with the fog and shadows, unable to rest, unable to move freely. Every so often, a movement in the mist caught my attention, and I stiffened, willing my eyes not to linger. I realized then that these shadows weren't just reflections, they were extensions of the rig itself, feeding off attention, reacting to presence. The rule wasn't superstition, it was survival. I whispered nothing, spoke nothing, and kept the shadows at a safe distance with mere observation. Finally, dawn approached, and the fog began its slow retreat. The shadows, one by one, dissipated with the mist, leaving the rig eerily empty and quiet. My knees nearly buckled when I finally allowed myself to exhale fully. Petrov appeared on the walkway below, giving a small nod of reassurance. Neither of us spoke. We counted silently, checked the instruments, and noted that no one was missing this time. But the memory of the shadow at the catwalk lingered, and I knew it would be back. The rule had been obeyed, but survival felt fragile. Even as I left the crane cabin to descend to the deck, the fog clung to the rig like a warning. The sea beyond shimmered faintly, green in patches, betraying no hint of what had lingered within it. I reminded myself once more of the rule, internally repeating its words as a mantra. Never speak, never acknowledge, never invite the shadow. The sun broke over the horizon, pale and weak, but I could still feel something watching from the fog's edge. I didn't know if it was waiting, learning, or simply existing. All I knew was that next time, any mistake could be final. The fog lingered even after sunrise, curling over the deck like a living blanket, refusing to dissipate completely. I remembered Rule 4, never step onto the fog-covered deck alone, as I watched the walkway beneath me, droplets clinging to steel cables and glinting faintly in the pale light. Yesterday's shadows still haunted my thoughts, and I wasn't about to test whether isolation was safer than counting or silence. Every nerve in my body screamed that the rig was a trap, a delicate balance of rules we barely understood. I gripped the railing tighter, staring at the gray expanse that could swallow a man in a heartbeat. Petrov appeared beside me silently, as if he had read my thoughts. "You know the rule," he said, his voice low and cautious. I nodded, unable to speak without feeling the weight of the fog pressing in. Together, we descended to the main deck, our boots clanging softly, a rhythm that seemed to push the mist aside just enough for us to see. The others had started their morning tasks, but I noticed each movement was calculated, careful, as if the fog could reach and snatch them at the wrong moment. I tried to focus on the machinery, the cranes, anything familiar, but the fog kept curling around everything like hands trying to grab my attention. As we moved across the deck, a faint shadow flickered in the corner of my eye. I froze. The mist had a way of distorting shapes, creating limbs where none existed, and yet it felt deliberate, purposeful. Petrov didn't notice it, and that made me wonder whether I was seeing too much or too little. "Don't go near it," he whispered, nodding toward the shadow. My stomach twisted, and I clenched my fists, trying to will myself to continue toward our work without acknowledging the moving shape. The fog seemed thicker here, heavier, almost tactile in the air. The crane controls needed adjustment, and I leaned over the edge to inspect the cable, the steel slick beneath my fingers. I reminded myself of Rule 4, never step onto the fog-covered deck alone, repeating it mentally like a mantra. Each time my foot threatened to cross a faint patch of mist, I forced it back, counting silently to keep control. A sudden vibration ran through the deck boards, subtle but unmistakable. I looked toward the crane base and saw nothing, yet the feeling of movement lingered. My heart pounded in rhythm with the undulating fog, and every instinct urged me to retreat, to a safe spot near Petrov. Minutes stretched, and the fog thickened around the edges of the rig, curling up toward the cabins, into the crevices of the platform. The sea beyond was nearly invisible, a flat gray expanse that could hide anything. I noticed a shadow move across the deck, distant yet deliberate, shifting unnaturally as it approached the crane area. I froze, refusing to step forward. Petrov's hand rested lightly on my shoulder, steadying me, reminding me I wasn't alone. But even with his presence, I felt the fog pressing, insisting that I test the rule, that curiosity might override caution. The rig creaked, the metal underfoot groaning with the weight of unseen forces. Somewhere far below, a low pulse seemed to echo upward, vibrating through the deck boards. I wanted to call out, to ask Petrov if he felt it, but words lodged in my throat. Instead, we moved slowly, keeping to well-lit areas, calculating each step with care. I remembered the tales from senior crew members about those who ventured alone during thick fog. They never returned. Their voices haunted the intercom sometimes, only recognizable when the fog swallowed the rig entirely. At the edge of the deck, near the loading bay, a shape formed from the mist, tall, thin, almost human, but wrong. My breath caught. Petrov nudged me back, his eyes fixed on the figure. Neither of us spoke, yet the fog seemed to sense hesitation. The crane lights reflected dimly off the figure, and it moved with intention, as if testing whether we'd break the rule. I pressed against the railing, forcing my legs to stay in place. To step forward alone would be unthinkable. Every instinct screamed that this was the exact moment the rule existed to prevent disaster. Time warped as we waited for the fog to shift and thin. Each second felt like a minute, each breath heavier than the last. The shadow remained at the periphery, neither advancing nor retreating, as if suspended in some liminal state. I forced myself to look down at the deck, rather than the figure, counting the boards, counting the bolts, grounding myself in physical reality. Petrov mirrored the same actions, silently affirming the rule's purpose. The fog wasn't just water suspended in air, it was deliberate, aware, waiting for someone foolish enough to step out alone. Finally, a subtle change in the mist told me it was thinning. The shadow dissolved as if it had never existed, leaving only fog rolling lazily over the deck. I exhaled, feeling the tension leave my shoulders in increments, but not fully. The crane operations resumed, the others moving carefully, but silently, aware that the fog could claim anyone. I realized that Rule 4, never step onto the fog-covered deck alone, was not about fear alone. It was about coordination, about surviving together, when the mist pressed against your skin, whispering threats that didn't belong to anyone alive. Even after the fog fully lifted, I felt its presence linger. Every corner of the deck seemed to carry a shadow of yesterday's shapes. I kept close to Petrov, moving cautiously between the crane and the cabin. He didn't speak, but I knew he was counting silently, watching for any anomaly. I imagined what might have happened if I had gone alone, if I had ignored the warning. The rig had survived so far because of these rules, rigid, absurd, and yet undeniably alive. The mist would return, and when it did, I knew the next test would come even sooner than expected. As night fell, we prepared for the shift change. The fog rolled in again, heavier than before, and I hesitated at the threshold to the deck. Petrov caught my eye and gave a slight nod. I followed him, every step deliberate. Somewhere deep in the mist, something moved, watching, patient. The crane towered above us, a cold steel sentinel. I realized that obeying the rule wasn't just about staying safe, it was about staying aware. The rig had a rhythm, and the fog tested whether we could keep pace without losing ourselves. The edge of the rig felt different at night, sharper somehow, as if gravity had a pulse of its own. I recalled Rule 5, always maintain eye contact with the crew. When on the edge as Petrov and I prepared the crane's load near the railing, the fog pressing in from below and all around. Every man on the rig knew that being alone near the edge invited mistakes, and something worse. I forced my gaze toward Petrov, then to Marco and back again, realizing that even glancing away felt dangerous. The mist distorted the horizon, hiding the sea's surface, making it impossible to know how far down the drop really was. Movement flickered at the corners of my vision, but I refused to look. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the deck, but with Petrov nearby, I felt the rule's authority like a tether. We climbed higher along the crane, each step deliberate, each handhold tested twice before committing. The fog swirled beneath us, curling against the crane's structure like fingers trying to pull us into its depths. I tried to ignore the shivering air and focus on the crew below. Maintaining eye contact wasn't just about awareness, it was about survival, anchoring yourself to reality while the fog threatened to erase it. I noticed the others moving with the same rigid coordination. Each crew member's eyes tracked someone else, a chain of visual connection across the platform. It created an invisible network, a fragile barrier against the fog's pull. I glanced toward the southern walkway and saw one of the shadows from before lingering at the edge of visibility. My breath caught. Petrov saw it too, his grip tightening on the railing. Neither of us spoke. The fog was too thick, too alive. The rule wasn't optional. It was the only thing standing between us and the unknown waiting beyond. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying a wet metallic scent across the deck. I shivered, realizing that one misplaced glance could break the chain and the consequences would be immediate. Maintaining eye contact felt almost like a ritual now. I found myself scanning every man, acknowledging them silently, willing them to stay aware as much as I stayed aware of them. The fog moved differently around us now, curling, receding slightly, then rushing forward as if testing the boundaries we had set. The crane groaned under weight we didn't see, a constant reminder of the platform's precarious nature. Petrov whispered, "Edge work is where most lose themselves." I nodded, tightening my stance and returning my gaze to him. The shadow I'd glimpsed lingered at the deck's far end, stretching unnaturally, just beyond the beam of the crane lights. Every muscle in my body tensed, resisting the urge to turn and acknowledge it. I felt the rule's grip tighten like a rope around my mind. Not a single word was spoken, but each glance toward a crew member reaffirmed our connection. Each held gaze a lifeline against the fog's invisible reach. Minutes passed in a silence heavier than the fog itself. I realized that the mist seemed to respond to our coordination, wavering and pulsing around those who obeyed the rules. Those who had failed this rule in past stories were the ones who vanished first. Whispers claiming the fog claimed their shadows as payment. I refused to break the chain, to let a single lapse in eye contact occur. Every step along the edge required verification, acknowledgement, and an internal repetition of the rule as if it were a mantra. The crane towered above, the deck below vanished into gray, and the fog waited patiently. Suddenly, the intercom crackled with a distorted voice, almost echoing our own words. I stiffened, keeping my gaze on Petrov and Marco, forcing the others into my line of sight without breaking the chain. The fog thickened around the base of the crane, curling toward us with intent. I felt a presence brush against the platform, a subtle movement that made my hair stand on end. The crew's coordination was the only thing separating us from the unknown lurking in the mist. I counted silently, eyes moving from man to man, heart hammering, aware that one mistake could unravel everything. Time became meaningless as the fog pressed harder, shaping and reshaping around the deck. Shadows stretched, merged and disappeared, but our chain of visual connection held firm. I thought of the past disappearances, of the stories whispered by senior crew members about those who looked away, who faltered. I refused to become another tale. The rule wasn't just instruction, it was a defense, a protocol for surviving when the world itself seemed to rebel. My eyes burned from staring, but I didn't blink longer than necessary, refusing even the briefest lapse. The fog began to retreat slowly, leaving behind a damp, glimmering deck and crew still rigid from tension. Petrov nodded at me, a silent acknowledgement that we had survived this round. I allowed myself a slow exhale, but my mind remained alert. The edge was no longer just metal beneath my boots. It was a threshold, a boundary between safety and the unknown. Maintaining eye contact had kept the fog at bay, kept us tethered to reality. Yet I knew it would return, stronger, testing the limits of our discipline and resolve once more. The moment I climbed out onto the deck, the fog wrapped around me like a living thing, curling into the crevices of the rig, slipping under boots and around railings. I remembered Rule 6, never touch anything that moves on its own, as I noticed a crate sliding slowly across the platform, though no one was near it. My heart jumped, and instinctively, I stepped back, my hand brushing the railing instead of the wood. It moved steadily, deliberately, as if aware of me, gliding without effort, leaving faint tracks in the wet steel beneath. Every rational thought told me it must be wind, or a loose line, but nothing on the rig should move without someone holding it. Petrov appeared beside me, cautious and silent, his gaze fixed on the crate, as though he'd been expecting it. "It's never wind," he muttered under his breath, eyes flicking around the fog-dense deck. I nodded, forcing myself to stay still, gripping the railing with tense hands. The fog made the distance between objects ambiguous, hiding shadows that didn't belong. A cable swayed slightly from a nearby crane, though there was no breeze to justify the movement. I knew the rule wasn't superstition. Anyone who broke it risked drawing attention from the fog itself, and attention here wasn't something you survived. We watched as the crate glided closer to the crane base. I wanted to speak, to tell someone to move it, but my voice caught in my throat. The platform felt unnervingly empty, yet heavy, as if unseen hands pressed down on the metal surfaces. Every step we took to avoid the moving objects had to be measured, calculated. I noticed a small toolbox rocking back and forth near the storage bay, and I forced my eyes away, focusing instead on the crew across the deck. Each glance confirmed someone else was watching, someone else obeying, maintaining the unbroken line that separated us from chaos. Minutes passed, and the fog grew thicker, curling around the rig in tendrils that seemed almost alive. The crate stopped abruptly near the edge of the deck, and then shifted slightly again, as if considering its next move. I felt my pulse in my ears, louder than the hum of machinery. Petrov did not flinch, moving with the kind of cautious confidence that came from surviving previous encounters. I had to remind myself not to reach out, not even to steady the crate if it bumped too close. The rule was clear: touching was invitation. Ignoring it might keep me alive, and touching it could cost more than just my life. A sudden vibration ran through the deck, subtle and almost imperceptible, but enough to make the crane shudder. I swallowed hard, keeping my eyes trained on the crew while the crate seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. The fog bent light around the edges of the platform, masking shapes that might have been human, or might not have been. Somewhere, far below, the water lapped against the rig, with a sound that resonated unnervingly, as though echoing every heartbeat on the platform. I tried to steady my breathing, reminding myself that the rule existed for a reason. The fog rewarded patience, punished curiosity. The crew began moving cautiously toward the next task, eyes flicking repeatedly toward me. I followed the flow, my boots careful on the slick steel, counting every step to ensure I didn't accidentally disturb anything that might react. The fog continued to shift, tendrils curling toward our legs, teasing our attention. I felt the pull of the crate behind me, a subtle call I had to ignore. Every instinct screamed to interact, to investigate, but survival depended on restraint. I gripped the railing tighter, my knuckles white, and kept my gaze on Petrov, who mirrored my careful movements exactly. Something else moved at the far edge of the deck, a coil of rope rising and twisting slowly, seemingly alive. I froze, heart pounding, and reminded myself silently, Rule 6, never touch anything that moves on its own. Each subtle twitch of the rope, each glide of the crate, seemed to test whether we were paying attention, whether we respected the boundaries of the fog. I understood then that the rule wasn't about fear. It was about observation, about letting the rig, the fog and whatever lived within it move without interference. Touching it would be provocation, an invitation to an unknown force. Hours dragged on as we completed our tasks without incident. The fog thickened around the edges of the rig, bending light, softening edges, and making familiar equipment look like something else entirely. I noticed subtle movements everywhere, chains swaying, ropes curling, crates inching imperceptibly, yet none of it responded to our presence. As long as we obeyed the rule, the tension was exhausting. I could feel every nerve in my body coiling and uncoiling, waiting, anticipating the slightest anomaly, knowing that a single misstep could change everything. As dusk approached, the fog began to recede, leaving the rig glistening with condensation and eerie calm. Petrov and I moved toward the cabin, avoiding the edge, keeping our eyes on each other as we passed every object that had moved on its own. I exhaled, though unease remained, the memory of the crate's deliberate glide lingering in my mind. The fog had retreated, but the rig seemed charged, almost waiting. I knew tomorrow it would return, and with it, every object that dared to move without a hand guiding it would challenge our focus once more. The hum of the rig usually comforted me, a low constant that reminded me the platform was alive. But tonight, it carried something else. I remembered Rule 7. Never ignore the whispers in the machinery, as I climbed the ladder to inspect the crane controls. At first, it was subtle, metal stretching, gears turning, but underneath it, a rhythm that wasn't mechanical, almost like soft voices murmuring just out of reach. I froze, leaning closer to the panel, straining to listen without responding. Something was trying to communicate, and the rule's warning pressed against my mind like a warning bell. Don't listen too long. Don't answer, or it will know you're paying attention. Petrov was already at the base of the crane, checking the cables with careful, deliberate motions. He glanced up at me, eyes wide but expression calm. "It starts tonight," he whispered. Once the fog thickens, the whispers follow the cables. I nodded, moving cautiously along the walkway, each step echoing in rhythm with the metal underfoot. The fog pressed against the rig again, curling along the deck beams, masking shapes and exaggerating every shadow. Every instinct told me to step back, to ignore the sound, yet a part of me couldn't resist tracing it, imagining what might be hidden in its cadence. The machinery hummed, subtly at first, then louder, pulsing with life I couldn't name. I could almost swear the whispers were repeating fragments of conversations we had days ago, names and numbers that weren't meant to be remembered. My hand hovered over the control lever, and I forced myself to focus on it instead of letting the murmurs draw my attention. Each vibration from the rig carried words I couldn't fully comprehend. Petrov's shadow flickered in my peripheral vision, a constant reminder to obey the rule. The fog outside grew heavier, blending with the metallic scent that always seemed to accompany these sounds. Minutes stretched endlessly as the whispers became more insistent. I counted silently, not letting my attention stray toward the source. The rhythm of the machinery was hypnotic, almost gentle, and yet a deep unease twisted in my gut. I imagined voices calling from below the deck, mimicking crew members' tones. One of the shadows shifted along the railing, as though synchronized to the murmuring. I forced my eyes on the control panel and repeated the rule mentally, over and over, to keep from responding instinctively. Touching the levers was fine. Listening too closely was not. Petrov's voice crackled over the radio. "Careful, measured. Don't let it find a pattern," he warned. I didn't understand entirely, but I obeyed. I worked the crane methodically, ignoring the subtle syllables that tickled my ear, counting my breaths, counting each joint in the steel structure I could see. The fog thinned slightly, revealing the platform in wavering clarity, yet I could sense movement along the edges. The whispers never stopped, just lingered like a presence that needed acknowledgement. Any acknowledgement might give it a foothold, and I refused to give it even that. The crane groaned as I shifted the load into position, metallic shrieks blending with the faint murmur of the fog. I realized the whispers weren't random. They were testing us, probing for reactions. My hands stayed steady, my eyes on Petrov and Marco, ensuring our line of connection remained unbroken. Each slight shift in the machinery sent vibrations through my fingertips, another opportunity for those whispers to lure a careless operator. I could feel my pulse in every finger, every toe, every breath, yet I forced myself to obey the rule and pretend I hadn't heard anything. A sudden echo moved through the rig, distant yet sharp, and I froze mid-motion. The whispers surged briefly, urgent, teasing, repeating a word I couldn't place. My stomach clenched as the fog pressed against the crane's base. I realized the voices weren't coming from a single source. They were everywhere, in the cables, the gears, even the deck itself. Ignoring them was harder than any physical task. My eyes flicked constantly to Petrov, who kept his movements methodical, unaware of the subtle shifts in the shadows around us. The rule wasn't just caution, it was the only way to maintain focus, to prevent something from noticing us fully. Hours passed, the whispers never leaving, always there as we completed our tasks. I realized that the fog outside seemed to pulse in sync with the murmurs, twisting in shapes and patterns that defied logic. Any moment of distraction could have consequences. The crate from earlier now sat still at the edge, inert, but I could sense the residual energy in the metal, echoing the whispers faintly. My hands ached, my mind stretched to the breaking point, but I didn't speak, didn't respond, just maintained eye contact with Petrov, obeying every nuance of the rule. Dawn arrived, the fog retreating slowly, yet the echoes lingered in the machinery. I exhaled, but the tension didn't leave me. Every cable, every chain, every gear seemed to carry a memory of the night, a subtle warning that the whispers were always present. Petrov and I descended together, each step deliberate, silent, careful. The rig itself seemed to exhale as the fog thinned, but I knew the next night would bring the voices again, testing patience, resolve, and awareness. The rule had saved us again, but the lingering presence promised it would return, waiting for anyone to falter. The horizon seemed endless tonight, a flat gray expanse blending with the fog that hugged the rig like a second skin. I remembered Rule 8, never turn your back to the open sea, as I stepped onto the deck, the wind slicing through my jacket, carrying the faint tang of salt and something metallic. Every instinct told me the ocean was alive with eyes that followed, waiting for the moment someone let their guard down. My gaze remained locked on the waves, scanning the undulating surface, while Petrov and the others moved with careful precision. Each step away from that edge felt like a test, a silent trial to see if I would survive its pressure. The fog rolled in heavier than usual, curling over the deck and wrapping around the crane supports. Shadows of equipment stretched and warped with the shifting mist, but I refused to glance away from the open water. Every crew member on the rig seemed aware of the rule, moving as if in a synchronized dance, eyes scanning for anomalies. I could hear the distant creak of a cable, the soft groan of the deck, but each sound only reminded me to stay facing the sea. Turning my back, even for a second, could invite things I couldn't even name. I noticed a ripple in the water far off the starboard side, subtle yet deliberate, like a distortion in reality itself. My pulse quickened, every muscle tensing as the fog thickened between the rig and the horizon. Petrov caught my eye, giving the slightest nod of acknowledgement without speaking. Together we maintained our vigilance, never letting our backs face the open expanse of gray. A shadow shifted across the deck behind us, but I ignored it, repeating the rule silently to steady my thoughts. Focus was survival, distraction was an invitation. Minutes dragged on as the fog pressed closer, curling around the rig's edges, blurring the line between platform and ocean. I could sense shapes moving beneath the surface, subtle distortions that hinted at something massive just below. I fought the urge to turn, to see if the water held answers, but the rule anchored me. Petrov mirrored my movements, eyes never leaving the horizon. The rig seemed to hum in rhythm with the waves, the ocean itself a living presence, testing our discipline and attention. The tension was suffocating, yet obeying the rule kept panic at bay. A sudden gust of wind sent spray across the deck, chilling me to the bone. I tightened my grip on the railing and adjusted my stance, refusing to glance behind. Somewhere, deep in the fog, a sound like water breaking over metal echoed faintly, but I resisted the instinct to investigate. The horizon remained my focus, a thin boundary between safety and the unknown. I could feel the sea's awareness pressing in, probing for weakness, and every moment of vigilance reinforced my commitment to the rule. One misstep could undo everything. As night deepened, the fog seemed to thicken unnaturally, curling around the crane arms and deck edges, making familiar shapes unfamiliar. I kept scanning the open water, eyes straining to detect subtle changes. Petrov's presence beside me was a constant reassurance, but I realized this rule was ultimately solitary. You alone faced the expanse, alone with the possibility of what might rise from the depths. The rig creaked beneath our boots, each groan echoing like a reminder of our fragility. Still, I did not turn, not even for a second, trusting the rule to protect me. Hours passed with relentless scrutiny of the horizon. Small ripples became waves, waves became undulations, but I didn't flinch. I could sense the fog's restless energy, like it was waiting for someone to forget the rule, to let curiosity lead to a fatal glance behind. The ocean's surface shimmered faintly in the dim light, hinting at movements beneath, but I forced myself to maintain unwavering focus. Petrov and I moved carefully along the deck, transferring equipment without ever giving the water an opportunity to surprise us. The discipline was exhausting, but necessary. The rule had saved countless others before me. Dawn approached, and the fog began to pull back, leaving only the faintest mist curling over the deck. The horizon remained an unbroken line, pale and foreboding. I exhaled slowly, though tension lingered in my shoulders. The rig's creaks and groans blended with the faint hiss of retreating waves, a rhythm that seemed to praise our obedience. I knew the open sea would return in full force tonight, and the next crew shift would face the same test. But for now we had survived, kept our backs away from the unknown, and proved that Rule 8, never turn your back to the open sea, was more than superstition. It was survival. The fog had returned thick and unrelenting by nightfall, curling around the rig like fingers that wanted to pull me into the unknown. I remembered Rule 9. Never follow the lights that appear in the fog as I scanned the deck from the crane cabin, noticing faint, shifting glimmers far out in the mist. At first, I thought it was just reflections from the crane's lights or the glimmer of water, but they moved deliberately, sliding across the horizon, as if beckoning. Every instinct screamed to investigate, to track their path, yet the rule's warning anchored me in place. To follow them was to invite something I couldn't comprehend. Petrov appeared at the cabin base, eyes fixed on the same lights I was watching. "Ignore them," he said quietly, though his hand tightened around a railing, betraying his own unease. The fog distorted shapes along the deck, turning familiar equipment into unrecognizable forms. A soft, almost melodic glow danced near the crane base, lingering and retreating in unpredictable intervals. My heart thudded with every flicker, but I forced myself to observe without moving, repeating the rules silently. Obedience meant safety. Curiosity could mean disappearance. The lights pulsed in rhythm with the fog, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always teasing, always just beyond reach. I could feel a subtle vibration in the steel beneath my boots, as though the rig itself responded to their presence. Shadows shifted along the walkways in sync with the glimmers, stretching and bending unnaturally. I kept my gaze fixed on the horizon, ignoring the lights entirely. The rule wasn't just caution, it was the difference between returning to the cabins at dawn and vanishing without a trace. Petrov's steady movements beside me reinforced the need for vigilance. Minutes dragged, the fog thickening further with each passing moment. The lights flickered again, closer now, weaving between the cranes and the deck. I could see their reflection on the wet metal, hypnotic in their rhythm. I reminded myself silently, never follow them. Any temptation to step closer, to track their movement, felt dangerous, like a trap set specifically for the inattentive. The fog carried sounds that were almost voices, whispers mingling with the gentle creaks of the rig, coaxing anyone weak-minded toward the glowing shapes. I resisted, keeping every step deliberate, eyes fixed on reality, not illusions. Somewhere near the crane's arm, a shadow moved independently, pausing as if considering my reaction to the lights. My chest tightened, every nerve alert, yet I did not shift my gaze. I focused on Petrov, ensuring we remained synchronized, our eyes connected, our awareness unbroken. The fog seemed to pulse in response, thickening and thinning in unpredictable rhythms. The lights paused, hovering for a moment at the edge of visibility, then retreated just out of reach. I felt a shiver of relief, yet I knew they would return, stronger, with more insistent allure, testing the rule with every pulse. The hours crawled, the fog blending with darkness, creating shapes that weren't there, and hiding those that were. The lights returned intermittently, closer now, almost within reach if I dared to step beyond caution. I forced myself to resist, repeating Rule 9, never follow the lights that appear in the fog, my gaze fixed firmly on the crane platform and the horizon beyond. Each shadow along the deck shifted subtly, hinting at awareness of our discipline. I realized the fog and the lights worked together, testing focus, obedience, and patience. Any lapse could give them a foothold. Petrov and I moved slowly toward the cabin as the fog began to thin slightly, lights fading with it, but leaving an uneasy sense of presence. The rig seemed charged with tension, every metal joint, every cable vibrating faintly, as though acknowledging our adherence to the rule. I exhaled quietly, tension still coiling through my body, aware that survival wasn't complete. The lights, the fog and the shadows were patient. They would wait until tomorrow, or until someone foolishly strayed. Obedience was temporary safety, yet necessary for another dawn. The rule had saved us once again, though the memory of those shifting glimmers lingered, a subtle promise of the next test. The deck was quiet again by the time the fog began to drift away, but quiet on this rig never meant safety. I remembered Rule 10, never go below deck after midnight, as I watched the last traces of mist slip over the railings and vanish into the dark waves. The others had turned in early, exhausted by the long shift, leaving me and Petrov to complete the nightly inspection. The hum of the rig beneath our boots sounded deeper tonight, slower, almost deliberate, as if something below was breathing in rhythm with us. Midnight was minutes away, and every instinct screamed to finish quickly and stay above. The rule had been clear since my first day here: never descend the ladder after the clock struck 12. Nobody explained why. They just said it in that quiet tone the older workers used when remembering something they'd rather forget. I had dismissed it once as superstition, until the night we heard the metal below deck shift, like something crawling through the maintenance tunnels. Since then, I obeyed it like scripture. Petrov stood near the hatch, flashlight in hand, but he didn't move to open it. He didn't need to. The rule hung in the air between us, like an unspoken command. Still, curiosity is a powerful enemy. The hum grew louder, resonating through the steel, vibrating in the soles of my boots. It wasn't mechanical. It had a pulse, like a heartbeat buried deep within the rig. "You feel that?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Petrov nodded once, not taking his eyes off the hatch. "Ignore it," he said. "It's testing us." The words chilled me because he didn't sound convinced. The air carried a faint metallic tang, sharper than before, and I could swear the sound from below shifted tone the moment we acknowledged it. Midnight arrived without ceremony. The clock above the door ticked softly, a second hand sliding into place with mechanical precision. The hum below deepened instantly, as though the rig itself had been waiting for permission. The floor trembled slightly, then stilled. Petrov switched off his flashlight and motioned for silence. The deck lights flickered once, then steadied, their glow thin and sickly. I didn't need a reminder. Rule 10, never go below deck after midnight. But hearing it in my head again steadied me. I could feel something beneath us moving, tracing the paths of the pipes, slow and deliberate, like it was listening. A sound, soft, rhythmic, rose from beneath the hatch. Not footsteps, not machinery. More like the sound of someone dragging something heavy along the metal floor below. I stared at the hatch, waiting, praying it would stop. Petrov took a step back, motioning me to do the same. The rule wasn't about what you might find down there. It was about what might find you if you looked. I exhaled slowly, forcing my body not to react. Every muscle wanted to open that hatch, to see what moved, but instinct and training held me still. The rig pulsed again, under our boots. The sound continued for several minutes before fading completely. The silence that followed was worse. The rig felt empty, hollow, as if it had exhaled something into the water. Petrov finally spoke, his voice almost a whisper. "It passes through every night," he said. "It doesn't belong here, but this place calls it back." His words left me cold. I didn't ask questions. I just nodded, trying not to imagine what it looked like. The fog outside thickened briefly, brushing against the railings before dispersing again. The air felt wrong, heavy with something unseen. We stayed above deck, neither of us moving closer to the hatch. The night dragged, each minute slower than the last. Occasionally, the rig groaned as though something below pressed against its structure, testing for weaknesses. The sound of the ocean faded, replaced by the slow rhythmic vibration from the depths. I couldn't tell where it ended, and where my own heartbeat began. My flashlight flickered once, its beam weak and stuttering. The batteries were new, but I didn't question it. Some things on this rig didn't obey logic, and trying to make sense of them only made them stronger. Eventually, the vibrations ceased, leaving only the wind and the faint hum of generators. Petrov turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Never be the one to check it," he said quietly. "Every time someone goes down there after midnight, something else comes up." His words sank into me like ice water. I looked at the hatch again, its steel surface dull and cold under the faint light. For a moment, I thought I saw condensation forming, small drops of water that hadn't been there before. Then they vanished, leaving the metal perfectly dry. I took a step back and said nothing. We didn't leave our post until the faint light of dawn touched the waves, painting the fog in pale blue. The rig creaked, but it felt less oppressive, as if whatever moved below had retreated for the day. Petrov leaned against the railing, exhausted. "Another night done," he murmured, but his tone carried no relief. We both knew the rule had kept us alive again. I exhaled slowly, the air cold in my lungs, and glanced back at the hatch one last time. It looked perfectly ordinary now, but I knew the truth. Nothing beneath this rig ever really slept. The fog was relentless tonight, thicker than I'd ever seen it, crawling along the rig like fingers seeking weakness. I remembered Rule 11, the last rule is the one nobody survives, as I stood on the crane's deck, staring into the gray expanse that swallowed everything beyond a few feet. Every sound felt amplified, the groan of metal, the pulse of machinery, even the distant crash of waves against the platform. Petrov and the others were shadows in the fog, their eyes wide, movements precise, but there was a tension I had never felt before. This was different. Tonight the rule wasn't a warning. It was an executioner waiting for its moment. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying the scent of salt, oil, and something sharp metallic, impossible to identify. Shadows danced at the edges of the fog, coiling in unnatural ways, and I felt the pull of the unknown beneath my boots. The previous rules had kept us alive until now, but there was no preparation for this. I could feel the rig vibrating under the weight of unseen presence, like it itself was holding its breath. Every instinct screamed to run, but I couldn't move. The last rule wasn't about caution, it was about endurance, and endurance alone would not save me. Petrov's hand gripped my shoulder tightly, anchoring me to the platform, though he seemed more fragile than ever. "This is it," he whispered, voice trembling. "We've followed them all, and now it chooses." I wanted to argue, to say we could outrun it, defy it, but the fog pressed in so close that it felt like it had swallowed my thoughts. Shadows coalesced at the deck edges, forming shapes I could not identify, twisting, stretching, crawling without limbs. The crane above groaned, chains swinging slightly, though the wind had died. The rig itself seemed aware, holding its breath along with me. I could feel my pulse pounding, like an alarm signaling the inevitable. The fog seemed to thicken, curling around each of us, pressing so close I could see droplets forming in the air. Petrov's eyes met mine, silent acknowledgement that nothing beyond our discipline had kept us safe this time. Shapes moved in the corners of my vision, almost human, almost familiar, yet utterly wrong. The rig vibrated again, subtle at first, then like a warning drumbeat. I remembered every rule, every moment of obedience, every shadow avoided, every glance held, and yet, the final test wasn't about what we did. It was about what we could endure. It was about staring into the abyss and realizing the abyss stared back. A sound emerged from the fog, deep, resonant, impossible to locate, a pulse that seemed to come from the deck, the sea, and the very air at once. The crew froze, all of us linked by fear and experience, waiting, knowing that any misstep could be final. I wanted to look away, to step back, to escape, but I couldn't. The fog pressed alive, aware and hungry. Shadows rose from the deck's edge, coiling like serpents, yet no one reached for them. The last rule wasn't about action, it was about submission, survival by restraint alone. I felt the fog testing me, each pulse a reminder that tonight, obedience might not even matter. Time became meaningless. Seconds and minutes bled together as the fog moved in unison with the unseen presence, tracing our positions, measuring our responses. The crane groaned, cables swinging without cause. I realized the final rule was the culmination of all the others: eye contact, isolation, fog, machinery, lights, the sea, the unseen, everything. The rig seemed alive, aware of our awareness, responding to our discipline and testing our limits. I could hear faint murmurs, whispers, echoes of the rules themselves, almost taunting us, and in the center of it all, the fog awaited, patient and relentless. Petrov's hand remained on my shoulder, but I could see the tension etched into his every movement. The shapes in the fog drew closer, not attacking, but observing, patient, deliberate. The air felt electric, vibrating with possibility, and I felt an icy certainty. The last rule wasn't meant to be survived. It was a measure of how long we could hold our sanity before the abyss reached inside. My mind raced, recalling every rule, every warning, every cautious movement we had taken to this point. Obedience had guided us this far, yet here at the edge of everything, it felt meaningless. Then as the fog twisted violently around the crane tower, I realized that survival was not a promise, but a fleeting grace. Shapes merged, shadows stretching impossibly across the deck, reaching for more than flesh, for something deeper, for attention. My breath caught, muscles tensed, and I understood that the last rule was a reckoning. It didn't care about discipline, fear, or knowledge. It was simply waiting for the moment it could touch the unprepared mind. I gripped the railing, heart hammering, the realization settling in. The final rule was not a warning, it was fate. And then for a heartbeat, everything paused. The fog, the rig, even my racing pulse. The shadows lingered, coiled just out of reach, and I understood that the rig had delivered its verdict. Patient, precise, inexorable. There was no escape tonight. The shapes receded slightly, leaving a suffocating quiet, the kind that settles after a storm and before a disaster. I swallowed hard, knowing that the last rule had tested me beyond anything I had imagined. Whatever survived would carry the weight of all the previous rules, and even then, the rig, the fog, and the unknown would wait for the next mistake, the next moment of curiosity. I exhaled slowly, though the tension remained, gripping my chest like iron. The fog outside retreated slightly, revealing the first hints of dawn over the Black Sea. Petrov didn't speak, and I didn't ask. We both knew the last rule wasn't meant to be explained. It was experienced, it was endured, and its lessons lingered in the steel, the mist, and the shadows that refused to vanish. For tonight we had survived, but only because the fog, the rig, and the rules allowed it, temporarily, for now. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.